Hi, and welcome to this last session in Unit 310 on finance. Session 3, we're going to be looking at setting and monitoring budgets. But before we get started, let's firstly just describe what budgets are really about. Budgets are about planning future results, coordinating our efforts to allocate resources to achieve the best goals, and budgets are based on forecasts and what the probable future is going to be. So setting a budget builds on financial governance that we've discussed, using forecasting, and once agreed, then it needs to be monitored to ensure compliance, which we've discussed, against internal policies and processes. So let's take a look at the aims. So the aim for this session is to know how to set and monitor budgets, and the objectives: 2, explain how to set realistic budgets and plan for contingencies, and then describe the processes of monitoring budgets to ensure efficiencies and control costs. Right then, let's get going. So we know what a budget's for, but the specifics will differ depending on the organisation, the situation, but there are some key factors in setting realistic budgets, which is important, and planning for contingency. Part of setting a realistic budget is about ensuring that everything is included. That means using all the information available to us from within and externally. And that's going to be things such as, internally, previous budgets. They're a really key starting point. Having information about how budgets have gone in the past is really key. Market research. What have we as an organisation researched? What are we thinking about doing? And that moves on to what have gone into the marketing plan, an internal plan for ongoing and new business. Making sure it links with the organisational strategy, which is the direction of the organisation, and then that we're looking at all the risks. We've discussed risks before. What do we know about what could happen? It's the same, similar to project management, and we'll look at that a little bit more as we get further on with this unit. And then externally, we need to be up to date on things like market trends and market information, government and regulatory info if there's any changes. And all this information helps us to work on our financial forecasting, and the importance of accurate forecasting cannot be overemphasized. Forecasting allows businesses to better plan their next steps. So it's not just about surviving from day to day, but being able to more accurately understand what's needed, where we need to grow, and how we can finance that growth. Obviously, large enterprises, organisations may have whole teams of people responsible for financial forecasting and budgeting, but steering a large ship requires that expertise and forethought. But every size of business and department, even down to teams, can benefit from the knowledge that accurate financial forecasting provides. This is used to make decisions about the next steps, to create accurate budgets, and to just know where we're going and what's happening. So, accurate financial forecasting is a critical part of budgeting and business planning. Even though many events are unpredictable, it is very possible to put plans in place that will prevent such events, or at least minimize them, ensuring that the outcomes of those events don't have as much impact. This is where contingency planning comes in, planning to deal with the unexpected. An emergency fund, for example, based on the likelihood of that occurrence, allocating finances and resources for use in those times of financial crisis or other emergencies, when things just don't go to plan. So, contingency planning in budgets allows organisations to respond in a structured way to unplanned events, and is generally undertaken at the same time as you're doing your annual budgeting process. It's like creating a sort of survival guide, really, you could say. In a simplistic situation, budgeting for contingencies will in effect just be about creating 3 budgets: a best case scenario budget, an expected case scenario budget, what you want, or the worst case scenario. But of course, these things aren't always that simple or straightforward, and there may be a requirement for contingency in different areas. As part of setting the budget, we will need to consider different areas, such as income sources, things like hourly rates, production, service, sales, investment, income, loans, savings, all those sort of things. Fixed costs around things like rent, mortgage, utilities, equipment, servicing and renting, staff wages, bank fees, taxes, government fees, things like accounting, legal services, your insurance, cost for your website, and then variable expenses, which are going to be things such as raw materials, contractors' fees and wages, could be staff wages as well, advertising, transport, general consumables, and then one-off spending, so licenses, equipment, furniture, things that are just for that one budget and that may not carry over or may not be usable again. And with all the information, we can then consider any risks or uncertainties and quantify them. Like we talked about in project management, there are a number of methods of quantifying uncertainties, and then they'll be measured as some sort of contingency reserve using a cost estimate. And calculating the contingency cost is could be simply about just applying a predetermined percentage, say then 10% for emergencies, 25% for contingency, and many organisations will do it like that, and it will just be set. And others will have complex mathematical or statistical models to do it, and there's sometimes software that sets it up. But even though we use all this information, research, forecasting to set a realistic budget, it will only be effective if we regularly monitor and report against it. We need to know whether we're achieving the targets that we've set or whether we're going to need to revise the budget. And revising will normally be done based on variances, so the difference between the planned financial performance against the actual financial performance. And that variance will have a tolerance usually, and we will normally only take actions to revise the budget when it reaches a certain point. The variance could be due to things we've identified, it could be external environment, or it could be internal activities. But the point being, we will only know about these things, so we'll only be able to revise the budget if we've been monitoring them. External could be things such as changes in the currency markets, new legislation, economic changes, or a failed supplier that goes under, for example. Internal could be staff shortages or staff costs, equipment issues, production quality issues, poor financial planning or budget setting, in other words, not a realistic budget being set, failure to identify or consider all the risks, or failure to set up contingency or reserves for adverse conditions. So a number of them, but we need to consider these things because they're what's going to make a difference. So regular monitoring of expenditure and budgets is essential. It's not just to verify the expenditure against the target that was set in the budget, but it's also to identify changing patterns, circumstances, or things that need corrective action. So regular reviews are essential, and your organisational procedures or your frameworks that are in place should dictate when, but these reviews will usually be done no more than 30 days, so quite often monthly. That's the standard, and this is usually seen as a way of keeping in close touch with what's happening in the business and fixing anything that's going wrong before it becomes a big problem. Now, you could do it once a week if it's something critical, but obviously it takes up time, and from that you're probably going to prepare a report, and the examination of that business performance every week could make it very time consuming and you wouldn't have time for much else. However, leaving it too long can end up with, as I said, finding problems that have developed and it's too late to do anything about them. But whatever the period dictated in your organisation, you will need to look at information such as the full budget information for the area of activity. So the full year, the profile, year to date, the expenditure, the peaks and troughs that will be within that at particular points for the year, details of what's actually been spent to that date, details of future expenditure and commitments that you've already committed to, a balance then of those two, so a balance of what's remaining, so the expenditure to date, the commitments made, and then look at whether you're on target to what you said you would be. A forecast outturn, so that's predicting based on the current expenditure what the anticipated spend is going to be, and then explanations of positive or negative variances. So you'll be comparing expenditure and the forecast to get the variance, and together with the documented tolerances, you'll be looking at action plan and trying to work out what those variances are and where they've come from. So Talk there at the last one about explanation of variance, positive and negative. The variances will need analysing to gauge their impact of success on the business, and it's not necessarily straightforward. We'll be determining the variance between the actual and the budget, and that could be expressed in different ways. So it could be in monetary values, pounds, shillings, pence. It could be in percentages, or it could be in individual unit numbers. The items to which that variation applies will have to be indicated as either a positive result, so favourable, beneficial, or a negative result, so unfavourable, and will need a lot more investigation. A simple rule for evaluating those variances would be simple questions such as, will selling more make profit better or worse? Will spending more make the profit better or worse? Because it's not always as straightforward as, oh, that's a negative variance and therefore we've got a problem. Some variances can simply be eliminated through a process of what they call aggregation. So, for example, you've got a negative spend on electricity, so you're £2,000 over on your electricity expenses, and your telephone expenses and other utility is £3,000 less than you expected, so you're £3,000 up. Well, if we aggregate those two together and make them one line in the budget under utility expenses, then it would be a positive net of £1,000. So aggregation just gets rid of that straight away. In general terms, as we can see by the table, it's about identifying and categorising, analysing of the consequences as whether they're favourable or unfavourable. For example, an increase in actual costs, so expenditure, more than the budgeted cost, is unfavourable if it doesn't increase profits. But if that expenditure is then being replicated in increased profits, then it might be. Whereas an actual increase in revenue or profit above what's in the budgeted is favourable, unless of course we're having to spend more to get there, and then maybe it's not working out. So we need to take that into account. As we've seen, identifying deviations and variances is about calculating the difference between the budget and the actual results for that budget period. Those variances may be large or small in both monetary or percentage terms, and some may well be so small that they're not a problem and they're not even worth investigating. Some we may be able to use aggregation to get rid of, and in other things we may need to do some investigation, and that's where tolerances will come in key. And there are two sort of approaches we can take. Two sort of general common approaches, and the first is management by exception, where the organisation sets the manager a size of variance that is acceptable, and anything outside that should be investigated. So they have a tolerance limit, and that determines what they investigate. So general expression, it would be, say, as a percentage, and if they're 5% over budget in a certain area, they must investigate. And often they give them a process or a checklist to follow to guide them through what they should do in their decision-making process and that. The second is management by deviation, and the principle is that any variance may indicate an issue or problem. So it could have been that it was set up an unrealistic budget in the first place, which we've been discussing, or there hasn't been enough risk analysis done, or there's been a fluctuation in the currency markets. But whatever, all must be investigated with two sorts of routes really to sorting out the problem. The first is if the change is internal or external, is not controllable. So if we can't do anything about it, then you just need to adjust the budget to reflect the new environment. For example, I don't know, the price of a key supply increases due to a national disaster, or there's been your supplies are coming from a part of the continent that's had a natural disaster, then that's going to change the prices, and you just have to change the budget. And the other is, if the variance was within the control of the business, then it's about identifying the possible causes and taking action to manage those and to stop them. But after all that's done, at the end of the year, there will need to be some sort of full budget review, identifying what went well, what could have been done better, and some sort of report prepared, because we said right back at the beginning that the first bit of information you'd look in setting a realistic budget is you'd be looking at previous budgets. So if there isn't a good report on what could have been done better, setting out the lessons learned, then we're going to struggle to set a realistic budget in the first place. So that's rounding everything up. Let's just have a look back at the aims of the session. Right then, so this session's come to a close, and the unit has as a whole, and we'll be doing an activity in a minute just to finalise it. But our main aim for this session was to know how to set and monitor budgets. And the objectives were to explain how to set realistic budgets and plan for contingency. And we've talked about the information needed, about financial forecasting, and about planning for contingency. And then it was to describe the process of monitoring budgets to ensure efficiencies and cost controls. And we talked about regular monitoring, the variances, and managing those. So let's have a look at the activity. So look at activity, it's two parts. A reminder again that the activities for this unit are part of your assessment of your knowledge for this, so your assessor will be using that, so remember that when you're doing them. And the first part asks you to explain how to set realistic budgets, ensuring you explain how to plan for contingencies. So could explain the process in relation to your own workplace and organisation. Now, if you've started, as we've mentioned before, if you started to think about what budget it is you're going to be using for your evidence, then you might, if you've already started that, you might want to be explaining what the process was you went through. And if you're about to do it, then you might want to use this as a sort of planning for that. And then part 2 says, describe the process of monitoring budgets over a period of time relevant to the budget period. Now, you may want to describe what happens in your workplace again. It may be about how you're managing your budget or what you're planning to do in managing your budget, but you need to be showing how this is going to be ensuring efficiency and how it ensures that you're controlling costs. Right, so 2 parts. Any questions, speak to your assessor, and don't forget to compare this with the evidence guidance sheet in the resources and start thinking about the evidence you'll be providing and how you're going to be actually showing your performance in the workplace. If you haven't got that sorted yet, you need to speak to your line manager and your assessor quickly.